All right, good morning. Buenos dias. So I'm excited. I'm very excited to be here. I've been up since 5 a.m. I'm from LA. It's very gloomy over there, and it's very bright here. and it's just great. And so this is already my fourth hour or whatever it is if I do the math right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through and share a story about what it means, what's the transformative potential of literacy in the work we do. It's very close to my pedagogical praxis. I am a profe at a university, but I also teach, and I see myself as an educator. And also, to some extent, an activist, although a lot of the activist work that I do has shifted into classroom spaces. And those also intersect with community spaces. I'm going to kind of unpack that. But this talk, well, first, let me step back. I want un agradecimiento for the Culture Responsive Center here, Lorenzo Lopez, reaching out. Also, I want to recognize the native land that we're here, Tohono O'odham, and also Pascual Yaqui, among different nations. I think that's very important, and to do that recognition. So this talk is about literacy, as you can tell, the title, From Reading the Word and the World to Rewriting Nuestras Vidas, reclaiming academic, cultural, and spiritual selves through literacy practices. This talk is about literacy, but it's also about learning. But literacy and learning cannot be discussed without addressing who is learning and toward what aim. So this talk is about students, children, and youth, and babies, primarily, as subjects in history, but also as cultural, and I dare say, spiritual beings. The concept and the notion, or even the language of spirituality, we tend not to talk about it, especially in the context of public schools. But I think we are very spiritual in what we do, and I'm going to unpack that today. But this talk is also about mediation, and I'm using a very complex term, but what that is the ways in which we, as educators, facilitate practices oriented towards the rehumanization of our students, but I would also add ourselves. What Chuko was talking about in the morning, everything I'm going to say, it is about learning, but it's not going to go anywhere if it is not transformative to ourselves as educators or administrators of the people who are in those spaces. So I use the terms academic, cultural, and spiritual in my title because I have come to learn, working alongside students and through my own familia, that we are holistic beings, that education is not just an academic endeavor, but it's, I dare say, primarily cultural and spiritual praxis. What educators do is not just teach skills and content. I know we're in the era of the Common Core, and that tends to be the emphasis. Or when teachers say, I teach English, yes, you do that, but you also teach and work alongside students, and we often forget that, and that's an important shift. So we are cultural and spiritual beings. So what we also do, we engage in cultural and spiritual practices, many of which are intentional, others the outcome of unintended forces, stemming from institutions and historical arrangements that may be questionable at best and detrimental and harmful to students and their development at worst. I'm talking about institutionalized schooling. Schooling, the socialization to particular social practices and arrangements and identities is very different from education, which is also very different from educación, which has to do with values. It's tied to life, it's tied to our survival and our navigation and our development as human beings. Often schooling doesn't do that, and it's not about that. But I want to begin with two stories. One of them, so I'm right now currently getting into Taíno, which is a historical novel. And it is about Huaycán, or Diego Colón, Dieguillo as he's referred, who was Christopher Columbus's interpreter. He's Taíno from the island of what is today the Bahamas. Taíno is a historical novel that blurs the lines between fiction and historical reality. It is written as a decolonial text. As the author Jose Barreiro comments, Diego's manuscript reopens a historical record and his is an indigenous voice. Writing in 1532, 40 years after Columbus landed in the Americas, Huaycan's character comes to life through his vivid and powerful portrayal of the underside of the colonization of the Americas. I will write for you, my Taino ni Taino. So this is, Huaycan saying, natural White City relatives, for those of you who will survive, for those of you in times to come who will remember that your fathers and your mothers, your grandfathers and grandmothers were a people. So here Huaycan recounts his dialogue with Bartolomé de las Casas. If you're familiar, Bartolomé de las Casas it opened the whole question about the humanity of native peoples. And even though Bartolomé was inhabiting a very contradictory space, you're talking about Catholics who had come to both indoctrinate, transform, and in many ways dehumanize native populations. So Huaycan is having this conversation. He says here, this is taken straight out of Taino, the novel. I promised, Good Friar, to tell you about the meeting and not get too involved in my own story. You say we were like Christians in our way of worship, that we believed in similar spirits. I will say it is true that our people had some similar ideas to yours. But another truth is you came from a world other than ours. And that world you brought with you, and with it you saw everything of ours. And with your words you renamed and changed everything that was obvious before. At this part in the novel, so it's very beautiful text. I would recommend it to use it in classroom spaces. I'm using it to think through how narratives and stories from what are considered very different places, so we're thinking about the Caribbean, intersect with the kinds of histories of the people that where I come from. And this is not a fantasy. I'm going to frame that because often people think about these as this is just a fantasy. We got a native perspective. It's fabricated. It is decolonial, and I'm going to explain that in a little bit through the talk. But this is very powerful because De Las Casas is basically trying to get Huaycan to say, look, just argue that your practices are very similar to Christianity. Because by so doing, all we have to do is petition back to the queen. I don't know what queen it was. But you have to petition back, and we will probably eliminate the encomienda system, and we will make sure that you are integrated into our ways of being in a so-called kind of not so violent way. And so this is very telling. Later on, what happens, this is another scene that struck me. Here Huaycan recounts the meeting between Christopher Columbus and Bayamo, who's a leader of Baracoa, which is in the southeasternmost part of Cuba. Cuba is a very big island, the biggest in the Caribbean. It's about 700 miles long. And this is a conversation that I think tells us a lot about the way people were thinking through the idea of spirituality and how it's in everyday life. Colón interrupts Bayamo, and Huaycan tells us that that never happens in the community. We don't interrupt elders. There's a process. Colón just comes and interrupts in the ways that he is. And then Bayamo kind of stops and says, what spirits would I speak about? So because Colón says, you're talking fluff, you're talking magical stuff. We bring Christianity to you, and you're talking about these kinds of airy things. So Bayamo says, what spirits would I speak about? Bayamo responded, I speak of the grandmothers and grandfathers, the Taino who are in us. I speak of no one else. I mean only our old ancestor spirits, the spirit of the sea, the spirit of the mountain, the spirit of our incense, and our tabaco, spirit of the yuca, and our maíz. The term maíz comes from these areas, and those ones that forever have helped us. I want to emphasize the last part, in those ones that have forever have helped us. Because if we think of spirituality as our interconnectedness to others and those who care for us, we are all ethically and relationally here and present and alive. Primarily is going to be our parents or caretakers or caregivers, whoever those have been. And so why start with a story? And for me, to make it real, to ground this, I have to. I think that our lives are very storied. And Huaycan is telling us something that we can also learn in and through the story of another person. And this is Amarilis. I'm going to share her story. This is from the beginning. So I'm going to do some reading right now, but my talk is going to stop reading, and then I'm going to start moving and being a little more dialogical. But this is from the beginning of a text that Dr. Sleater and I are putting together. And we begin with this one child who you see here scribbling in the backyard. Amarilis is now a 4th grade student who has enrolled in 5 public elementary schools. Her parents are themselves intergenerational Mexican Americans. Dissatisfied with the way schools have treated Amarilis, her parents have navigated different schools and districts with the hope of finding classrooms that respect the development of children. Her parents recall several incidences that led to moving her to a different school. Ever since enrolling Amarilis in the first dual immersion language program, they were shocked with the relatively high number of students in their classroom. At 36 students per classroom and no instructional aid, teachers in the district, which served economically challenged and racially diverse students, were clearly overworked and could not meet the needs of students like Amarilis, who were already framed at such a young age as being behind. This is something that was said constantly in reading and mathematics. In meetings with teachers and principals, it became evident to Amarilis' parents that a culture of standards and test preparation had greatly eroded time for social role play, nap time, and recess for kindergartners and 1st graders. I don't know if this is the reality here in Tucson Unified, but it is pretty much what's happening. Perhaps the most telling part of the story is not so much the negative impact of a standards-based and testing culture on young children's educational experiences, but the insidious ways in which the curriculum fosters complacency and, quote, an American perspective that does not represent children like Amarilis. For instance, Amarilis came home one day with a set of readings about slavery in the United States. While her parents were pleased this topic was being addressed, the assignments and readings portrayed African American heroes and heroines of the time without a critical assessment of slavery, its genesis, or how it has come to profoundly shape the lives of African Americans today. Moreover, the unit on slavery conveyed a message of racial integration and peaceful and happy multicultural society, quote, that represents our country today, unquote. These are parts of the text. Fast forward to 3rd grade. Amarilis' parents were shocked when the series of chapters on America's Past, which is a series of adopted texts in the context of the U.S. Southwest, literally described English colonists such as Sir Francis Drake as major California pioneers. The next chapter of this district-adopted textbook skipped over a critical 200-year period, jumping from 1650 to 1850, literally. That's what the text did, and we saw it. The text made absolutely no mention of California Native Americans. If they appeared at all, it was in the initial chapter on the flora and fauna of tribes. This is no joke. Much less the fact that California was Mexican land, nor how the United States acquired such a vast territory. In 4th grade, Amarilis was assigned a California mission project, which asked students to, quote, write a report by visiting a California mission or to build a replica of a mission, quote. That was the assignment. In the readings and instructions for this mission system project, which was framed as a significant part of their semester grade and where a teacher dedicated 4 weeks of instruction, nowhere was there any reference to racial conflict or the treatment of Native Americans by Spanish missionaries. The entire project was literally ahistorical, focusing on the mission's architectural structures and reproducing a tourist brochure rendition of the past, thus erasing the atrocities committed against Native peoples. Amarilis' early experience with social studies is not just one of historical omission. Our concern is with the ways Eurocentric renditions of history devalue the perspectives of marginalized communities and the impact this has on a child's sense of self, as well as how it negatively undermines students' racial literacies. As a young Chicanita who experiences a world both inside and outside of school as thoroughly racialized and conflict-ridden, these superficial lessons do not equip Amarilis with vital tools for critically understanding and responding to burning questions she has raised to her parents. Questions like, why are African Americans killed by the police? Why does Trump hate Mexicans? Are all white people bad? To note, like many families of color, Amarilis' parents felt the need to supplement the curriculum with their own family history. In completing the California Mission Project, for instance, Amarilis' parents assisted her with taking on the project from a Native American perspective, rather than the seemingly neutral stance the project asked students to assume. To understand Amarilis' story, which is common to thousands of children daily, it's necessary to grasp the historical context that has shaped schooling in the U.S. Absent this contextualization, the tendency is to minimize the psychological and social impact of a Eurocentric curriculum, or to render its presence invisible altogether, and thus continue to perpetuate racism in our schools and our society. So Amarilis is my daughter, and it's very personal why I want to begin with her story, and why also it ties to Huaycan. She is behind, as a student, the constant message we would hear, never really asking her perspective. She's struggling with focusing, the constant thing we would see and hear. Amarilis eventually, and I quote her, "I don't like school, papi." How is it that a child who's so inquisitive, who is longing and nervous on that first day? I remember it was very emotional for us. You leave your child and it's like, oh, what do we do? And she's crying. Papi was also crying. Mommy had to work. She wasn't there that day. But I have flexibility as a professor. You kind of get to do all these things. But I've also been learning a lot through Amarilis. Amarilis, who in many ways was labeled as kind of couldn't focus. Well, then I started asking, well, what is it that you're doing? Part of what's happening in California with the Common Core, I recognize, for example, the mathematics has shifted to more sense-making approaches. I think that's a beautiful shift. But what's happening in California, I don't know if Arizona's doing this, they've actually added more worksheets. So now it's more. I mean, man, I talk about the trees and nature and also the stuff that's happening. And I asked Amarilis, well, how do you feel about these? And she's like, papi, I don't like it, And but what happens? Because I know in that kindergarten class, they had an amazing section that was like cooking and all kinds of stuff they can do. So because of the Common Core, now the pressure, the third grade testing that happens, they start preparing them in kindergarten. That's why the story about no nap time and the things, and many head nodding here. But I think one thing that teachers have not done with Amarilis is taking the time to understand who she is. And so Amarilis, like all of you, come from somewhere. This is the spirituality that Huaycan's talking about. Let's not make it too abstract. Let's make it real. So on one side, this is my mom's side. It's very personal to me. This is who she comes from. So the upper picture you see up there is my abuelito. He's the second man. He's a little older. Jose Hernandez is a bracero in Utah. He would move back and forth. They're from Jalpa, Zacatecas, the southern parts of Zacatecas, close to Jalisco. You see also on the right-hand side my abuelito and my tía Judith. They're working in the fields. This is a part of the history and the legacy of where Amarilis comes from, where I also come from. You also see on the bottom left my tía Socorro's workstation. So my mom, to this day, she's a garment worker. I woke up early today at 5. She wakes up at 4 every day. And she's been doing that since the age of 17 in Southeast LA. If you notice also Tonatzin, you see the Virgen de Guadalupe. These are all a part of what makes Amarilis. And to characterize her in very negative ways and to not see the totality of who she is or understand the strength that she brings is doing a disservice to her. But also I would say the teachers themselves are not developing. There's a whole other part of Amarilis. Amarilis is connected to Tucson, to some of the families that have been here intergenerationally, Sonorans. When there was no border, literally. I've come to understand a lot of that through my compañera. And on the left, you see an image. This is Tata Paul. They use Tata and Nana, I learned. And so Tata Paul and Nana Sarah Oton Velasco. And they're from Porterville. And I was doing some research and trying to think through what is it that we present here. These are working miners, familias that have worked. And so one of the things that I also learned is the racial covenants that were very much a part of what can be said was an apartheid society here. Very clear demarcated. And I quote, this is Das versus Bernal. No portion of the said property shall at any time be used, leased, owned, or occupied by any Mexicans or person other than that of Caucasian race. And this is an actual image that my father-in-law gave me to share today. And also the Phelps Dodge copper smelter in Douglas, Arizona. These are parts of the story of Amarilis. These I frame as also the legacies of where they come from as working Chicano peoples. But also it's a site and location of strength of where they come from. I think of my father as well, and I'm going to get to this concept of how we unpack literacy. But I think of my father, and I share a story because he does not have a PhD. He has a second grade education from Mexico. And he always tells me in Spanish, tú tienes un doctorado, pero ¿qué sabes hacer? You know, I'll translate for those of you, but it sounds like most people understood. You have a doctorate, but what do you really know? And he says that because I can't fix plumbing at home. We moved into a house, there was all kinds of storms happening in LA, tree fell, and then we had all kinds of flooding. And so that's when my dad would teach me also, and I was his peon. Okay, I'm gonna learn by working alongside you. With a second grade education, my dad can build buildings, you know, and so how can teachers like the ones that Amarilis have, how can they begin to understand the wealth, the cultural wealth and the knowledge that somebody like Amarilis already has and brings to a space? And even somebody like her dad, I'm a profe, or my compañera who's an attorney, you know. And I will share this story as well. When I show up at the school, these stories are very much alive because I'm usually haven't showered early as a professor. I have my sweats, and I don't tell teachers what my profession is or administrators, but they clearly have racialized me in very negative ways. And I have had the question, we moved to another district that's diverse, a huge Asian population, there's more Korean. And their question to me was, you know, so are you renting in the neighborhood? And so there's assumptions about class and how you had access. Even the principal who's African American, I got to hold them accountable. On the walk to my daughter's 504 plan meeting, was also asking and questioning like, well, how did you come to this district? We are thoroughly racialized, but through that also comes a strength. And what people don't understand about Amarilis, that she's very conscious and she has a lot of creativity in who she is. These are images of things she created. So we were at the Women's March in 2006 in Orange County in Santana, and all the children got together, and this is what she created. And this is another prophet, Dr. Noah Golden, who said, hey, like Amarilis created this. Did you tell her? Nobody told her. So it's probably the inflection of her being in activist spaces. Here's a picture of them. They were with the OC for social justice teachers, and they got in the front of the march. And that's my son too. He thinks he's a superhero, by the way. And he is. They are. But my daughter, in her image on the upper left, she wrote, we the people protect each other. And if you see the mouse, even a mouse, because it's very cognizant about animals and too. And then she also wrote, however you are. And I asked Amarilis, did you mean whoever you are? And she's like, Papi, I don't mean whoever is, however people want to be. So as a young girl, seeing also identities as fluid, I'm recognizing that we need to, in a very deep way, respect our very sense of being and who we are in the world. She also wrote something. Supposedly she's kind of behind 2 years. And so she, you know, when they asked them to do the little cards, so she wrote here, I love you, Dad. You make me happy. And I love you. Love Amarilis. And this is my favorite part. And then she drew herself. And then she drew the way she sees Papi. I'm a little darker skin. And I think it's beautiful. It protects me from the sun, although I start wearing a lot of, I get burned now a lot more. So context is important. Contexto. We have to understand the histories in which a student like Amarilis is operating, in which you all are operating. Absent that, I really believe we're going to be very lost. And what I'm hearing, the sense of the education that's been happening is this context has already been in place. And we're revisiting. I personally revisit it. Even as I present, I'm trying to make sense of what apartheid has meant in places like Tucson and what segregation has meant in places like Southern California and also here in the whole U.S. Southwest, also the South. But I'm looking a lot at the Southwest because we're here, and it's part of how I look at things right now. But the image you see on the lower right, those are braceros getting sprayed with DDT. The notion that they're kind of polluted, diseased. This is a more contemporary image. I don't know if any of you have seen it. It was right around 2006. Remember Sensenbrenner King, HR 437, very anti-immigrant, anti-raza specifically. And so they were gonna pretty much, they were criminalizing immigrants, but at the same time also teachers. If you knew students who were undocumented, according to this law, you were aiding and abetting a criminal. And so then we had the mass protest mobilizations in 2006. I know there were over 2 million people in LA alone. Chicago had about 1.8 million. They were the largest one-day, single-day marches, finally superseded by the Women's March that took place in 2016. But just to think, the ways in which these stories are created, these are what many scholars frame as master dominant narratives. And so the question that I ask is, to what extent is this context of racialization still present today? And I'm going to quote, this is from Louis Terman, Stanford University professor, founder of the Stanford Binet test, wrote, from the measurement of intelligence, high grade or borderline deficiency is very, very common among Spanish, Indian, and Mexican families of the Southwest, and also among, pardon the language, that's his language, Negroes. Their dullness seems to be racial, or at least inherent in the family stock from which they come. Children of this group should be segregated, so that's the answer that this provides, into separate classes. They cannot master abstraction, but they can often be made into efficient workers. From a eugenic point of view, so eugenics is the idea of perfecting the species, the human species, they constitute a grave problem because of their unusually prolific breeding. The question that I pose is, how are deficit ideologies of the early 1900s eugenics movement still present today? Because I see them alive with my daughter. It's one of the things that I work against. We have to, when we think of the bigger context, situate schools within that. Schools are not silos. They emerge in and through those contexts. They're integral to. It's all a tapestry. I'm trying to think of different metaphors of talking about this. What researchers have said and documented, and this is just straight up. One, deculturalization. It's removing our culture, replacing it with the dominant cultures. I want to qualify this. Deculturalization also happens amongst white groups. People have written about that. The way is this notion of whiteness. Some of you will understand if you think of telenovelas, like how do you say in English telenovelas? Soap operas. If you look at telenovelas, the way people look, very blonde and blue-eyed, this is very typical of the way we codify the way people are supposedly supposed to look. Even my daughter, who's been exposed to some of this, has been asking me, Papi, like, why do I not look that way? It is so deeply ingrained that when my daughter was born, my madre, who's darker skinned than I am, and I will be very open about this, but I check her on this. She asked, ¿Tiene ojos de color? Wanted to know, this is a translation in English, does Amarilis have colored eyes? What that means, are they blue or green? And then I asked my mom, well, my eyes are like dark black, not dark black, they're black, dark brown. Aren't those also colored eyes? Where do these storylines come from that we live and breathe seemingly, what seems so seemingly? Deculturalization is a major force and has been around for the longest here in the US. The other is what Dr. Angela Valenzuela talks about, subtractive schooling. You put a kid like Amarilis in the school, a month later, a year later, by the 4th grade, we've actually taken things away. Yes, they can perform on tests. Yes, it seems like they're learning certain things, but as a whole, it's kind of subtractive. Something isn't adding, something's not working. The other is this notion of deficit thinking. It's the work of Richard Valencia and others, what they talk about it, it's a mode, it's a discourse pattern. It's when we do not recognize the assets in individuals, what people bring, and we see them as deficient. And often, deficit logics play out when we're trying to account for students and when they're quote unquote underperforming. We tend to resort to things like they're just not engaged without contextualizing that, because I know students can also be disengaged, but what's the context? They somehow, I think it's the parents. The parents don't read to, so the irony about Amarilis, I don't reveal to teachers about my background, but that's one of the assumptions that was articulated. Are you reading at home? And that's when I told the teacher, with all due respect, but yes, we do read. I'm a profe, I hate to do that. We do a lot of critical literacies. My daughter actually has a YouTube channel because she loves to sing. And my compañera is also mariachi, and she's trying to bring that into the home. My daughter resisted that, but now she's taken up singing, and she sings very beautifully. That's an asset when we begin to understand the students. A deficit is just seeing the surface, labeling students, families in very negative ways. In the end, what encapsulates this is this notion of otherness. It's dehumanizing people, and it's rendering them what I frame as invisible. How is it that we invisibilize people, but how is it that people of color are also rendered visible back? Often what happens with brown bodies, they reappear as violent with young men. I'm not saying they're inherently, but it's the way they're codified. Just think of mass media, think of film and the work it does, because film is also playing out a master narrative. Think also the way gender and the way young women are portrayed as very passive, especially Latinas, as unintelligent. And it's kind of a romantic rendition of their lives that totalizes it. So I'm going to shift to two concepts. I want to unpack this notion of literacy and ground that in research and also culture. And from that, move into examples of my own teaching. Because I think that's the best way that I can present an idea, is by grounding it in my own experiences in what I do. So in terms of research, often what happens with literacy, when we think of literacy, we think of the speaking, we think of also writing and reading, right? Those are the three modalities that kind of dominate. And if you really think about it, within a certain lens, literacy is a mode of communication. Communication is being the broader sort of thing. And literacy being one modality, and from that there's different practices. And what's interesting about research is that we carry with us what I frame as very Eurocentric understandings of what literacy means. So I'll give you an example. The dominant narrative about writing has been that it emerged out of pictographs, cuneiform. And its earliest form of writing occurred in Mesopotamia in 5000 BC. You're going to find that in textbooks. That's going to be the master storyline. But an unconventional history, and one that some people have been looking at, is Australian Aboriginal art, and how that even took place 30,000 BC. I mean, we're talking about way back. It's very interesting because I've asked people and students, where does literacy come from? And most people point to areas of the Middle East. The same with agriculture. You probably heard that storyline, right? Where does agriculture begin? Where does civilizations begin? And often it tends to be someplace. Çatalhöyük is one of the areas. But it's interesting. I also hear narratives, no, it happened in Israel. Israel was the first civilization, and then people start fighting over where was the first one. But what's interesting about agriculture is there's a group of researchers who have been already at this for 30 years studying the agricultural practices of Native Americans in California. And one of the things they found is what they term pyrodiversity, that rather than thinking about agriculture as kind of tilling the land, planting a seed, and that defines agriculture, what Native peoples in California were doing were actually using fire as a strategy. And they document, these researchers, that at some point up to 2 to 3% of all of California was on fire. That's not possible. California is pretty vast. It's not possible for nature itself, like lightning, to do that. And so what they're looking at through all the evidence is the ways in which different communities, different tribes were in unison. So there was some political development of communication of how they coordinated the cross burning. Did all of this start in a particular place? Where did writing begin? And I want to trouble this notion. And so David Barton, in his book Literacy: An Introduction to the Ecology of Language, he says that there's been a dominant metaphor. Writing is evolution. So that's a linear metaphor. It's very ethnocentric. And there's this notion that writing represents progress, and it's the mark of civilization. We still hold on to that view. When we approach communities like my dad, second grade, and yes, he struggles with his writing because I've seen it. But does that mean he's not literate, right? When you think of the kinds of skill sets, what I just mentioned, that he can build structures. He's always teaching me so many things. He has like 10 PhDs. His literacies manifest themselves in a very different way. His form of writing manifests itself in a very different way. And so what David Barton says that we need to move towards alternative metaphors. And he says maybe one of contact and change rather than one as writing as evolution. So this is about nonlinearity. It's about thinking of things as endogenous, as growing from a place. And so from this perspective, writing, the alphabet, is seen as adaptation to language and environmental changes. Writing, the way we see it and the way we value it in schools. And I want to qualify what I'm saying. I'm not saying that we should not teach writing. I would contradict myself in practice and also the teacher education work I do. And even as a father, I would be contradicting one of the goals of what we try to do with our kids. I'm not saying that. But what I'm arguing is that we need to trouble what has become normalized. And especially when we work with diverse communities, youth who may be seen as deficient, who may be seen as they're not quite writing at 8th grade level. Well, if we looked at the digital literacy that they bring, maybe the writing is manifest very differently. So what research have talked about is we need to expand our notions of literacy, moving away from functional, so that's very traditional ability to read, write, and speak, to this is likely what the Common Core is promoting. I know in California it's manifestation, you're probably seeing it here, to disciplinary literacies. By that is meant an example, literacies as inherent or bound to a field. Like for example, chemists, the way chemists go about reading texts, the way chemists go about understanding. It's bound to the ways they do the work they do. Another example with mathematics. If we put the Pythagorean theory in the formula, many of you would go, yes, I understand it. Some people would go, what is that? Or like I personally would have to revisit it because it's been a long time. Or musical notes. Think of people who are musicians. I see that at the home as my compañera is trying to teach my daughter. She has a whole literacy that she has. I have nothing on that, but I can actually beat a drum. That's my literacy when it comes to music. Disciplinary has to do with particular practices. What we're moving towards as well is this notion of a critical literacy. What Paulo Freire said, reading the word, but also the world. It's reading intertextually. It's reading books like the one I shared at the beginning and trying to use those as vehicles for understanding the broader context of our lives and the world around us. So according to the research, literacies are multiple and can best be understood as context-specific practices. Literacies are intimately tied to consciousness, thinking, critical awareness, but I dare say they're also tied to the development of selves, of people. What sometimes people frame in this literature as a production of the self. I want to move to culture. So looked at literacy and culture, and then I'm going to get into talking about the way I do this work with youth and why that's important. So what does the contemporary research say? And so first of all, before I do that, on one end, when we come, just think about the notion of culture and your working definitions and understandings. On one end, you have individualistic, Eurocentric notions of culture as separate from people. So there's the individual, and culture is something, therefore, that we need to transcend. I've heard teachers say that. Culture is seen as an obstacle. That's one end. On another end, you have what's termed the ethnicization of culture, meaning the reduction of culture to particular ethnic racial groups. Like that's Mexican culture. And we use that a lot. I use that in my discourse. Yeah, that's Mexican food. This is what we do. That's black culture. That's Asian culture. What sociocultural theorist contemporary research is saying is that we need, what sociocultural scholars point to is the ways in which culture is lived, the ways in which culture is the water we swim in as human beings. It is what mediates thinking, actions, and our relations to each other. So sociocultural theory is a frame, and it's contemporary theory that's really troubling fields, but also in a very beautiful way, trying to recognize the diversity of practices and how communities grow and develop over time in their own ways. And one of the things I quote here from Kenichi and Dyson, the bottom part, they say all children learn language, but their learning is cultural and shaped by the socioeconomic, linguistic, and political circumstances in which their lives take shape. So sociocultural approach would argue, this is Barbara Rogoff, culture is not static. It is formed from the efforts of people working together, using and adapting materials and symbolic tools provided by predecessors, and in the process creating new ones. When you think of this notion of culture that sociocultural theorists are providing, yes, race intersects and practices do, but you also want to think, for example, when they say school culture, school climate, there are different ways in which schools shape. I just met with 2 schools who are trying to partner in a new program I'm going to be directing. One school was totally like a kind of market-based sort of, even the principal emanated that. Everything was about flyering, and we're trying to revamp the after-school programs because a lot of those are babysitting sites, and so parents are fully on board. We're going to do writing and Raza studies together, and so our parents are on board. When they hear about writing, Raza studies, what is that? So we have to work on that. But one of the principals told me students they're not going to show up. You need to create flyers that are just flashy, and that's the only way. And then he started talking about money, and that just threw me off because we're not making money. This is just us trying to redo fieldwork experience for the students that we work with at the university. Went to a whole different school in El Monte, closer to where I live. Very different ethos, the culture of the school, college access. They had the Chicanx pipeline, and as I met the principal comes from Chicano studies, had a totally different vibe and energy, and they already had programs in place. And so cultures vary based on the practices and the goals and what people create in that space. Scribner and Cole, they say the world in which we live in is humanized, full of material and symbolic objects, signs, knowledge systems that are culturally constructed, historical in origin, and social in content. Since all human actions, including acts of thought, involve the mediation of such objects, what they call tools and signs, they are on their score alone social in essence. Learning, thinking, and knowing are relations among people and activity with and arising from the socially and culturally structured world. Culture is what we breathe. We use it every day. I'm using it now as I speak. I'm using technology. Anything that's humanly created is culture. They're artifacts that are made. They have histories. And part of what we're trying to understand when it comes to literacy is what are those histories of the tools that we're appropriating? And how can we redirect those tools so that they better serve our communities, so that they rehumanize us in that process? So I'm going to shift to talk through an example of what I frame as these decolonial literacies. And this is work I've done with Santa Ana students using also youth participatory action research. And these are images that give you a little bit of context of the students. They engage in research, but one of the important things for me is the literacy work that needs to happen. We don't just go out into the field to study our community. So in this particular summer, the students, through kind of some discussions, the question of poverty emerged, especially in Santa Ana that sits in the orange curtain, as people call it. And Orange County is a very racist county. And as I've come to travel to Arizona, it's very similar to places like here. Right after the 45th became president, and I know when we talk, we're not supposed to talk about it. I know in the private institution I taught, you couldn't mention the president's name. Otherwise, you get in trouble because they have very strong contingent of students that have particular ideologies. But it's right after the 45th one, 2 white elders approached me. It was one of the gas stations on the way. It was one of the small ones. And they threatened me. And they said, your people are not going to last very long. And so I have to check myself because there was a masculinist sort of like You know, they looked older and like, what are they going to do to me? But my wife is, get in the car now. It's like, get in now, put up the windows. And she says, you know what? People carry weapons here in this state. And you don't know. She's from Tucson. And so we got in the car, and then the kids kind of got scared because what I've learned a lot through my children is that they have a beauty that they don't, you know, the filters as adults that we create through the violence that we experience, with trauma and all that, and suddenly we become numb. Children, they're in the environment completely and sense it. And my kids got nervous, and we drove, and about 10 minutes, we had to have a plática about trying to unpack what that experience was like. And so we have to, in the work that I engage in, look at things historically. And one way that we do that is through text. That's the literacy work. But that also happens through, and it's why I showed pictures of the students in the reading that I'm going to get to right now. I'm gonna talk through something that I think is very important, because this work that I do with these students, I have been learning it is about decolonization. And I know that colonialism may seem like a very loaded term and concept. We're not at a stage where Amarilis understands it, I think, very well, because she lives it. And we always begin with our lived experience. She lives it. And the most recent project she did, it was around California history, but we also started looking at like basic dictionary definitions of colonialism. And a lot of what you find is kind of like the classic sort of when one, it's kind of historical, but when one nation takes over another and extracts its resources, right? It can also be a form of imperialism. But how do we think about colonization as also inhering in our very bodies? How do we think of colonization as psychological, for example, and not just something that, say, is one country doing to another country? And so what this is borrowed from the work of Linda Tahi White-Smith, the Maori activist scholar. And what they talk about is how decolonization, how communities have responded to. And the way I interpret this, you want to think about colonialism as kind of the conditions that have set our lives in very negative ways. They've created racial categories. They've created class categories. They've dehumanized entire groups of people. It's led to genocide of Native Americans here. It's led to slavery, right? These are all the outcomes of what colonialism has meant. But what they've talked about is the processes in and through which people have worked their way to resist colonialism. And one of the things you might want to think of it kind of moving from up to the top, and it's not a hierarchy, but think of these as waves. You have the onset of colonialism, but then what is the first thing that happens? You have survival as a mode. If you think of an animal, this is a terrible example, but I have seen this in some parts where they beat a dog. What does the dog do? What does it do? Somebody says something. Well, it'll bark, but if it's beat hard enough, it'll cower. It'll cower, and it's just going to go somewhere. That's survival. But how do we move past survival? And how do we not inhabit that space? Because survival can also be very toxic. And so what happens is that decolonization is an intentional move to also begin to see our recovery in the process as we survive. And eventually, what the goal should be is human and ecological development, self-determination. And so in the work that I do, it's very important. I actually work through this diagram, and then we spend some time with the high school students to think through what this means. Something like this, I don't just throw. We come back to it. We have to understand the concepts and the terms. But what's, oh, shoot. Here we go. It wasn't on. But what's interesting in the work that I try to do intentionally, it's built on the work of others, is that in our pedagogy, a decolonizing pedagogy, it has various dimensions. And one of these, and the cogs are very terrible. This is the best thing I can do, but it's not supposed to be mechanistic. The cogs don't do service. But one of the things we do with students is we do a lot of counter storytelling. We name our world. We equip them with critical tools, to vocabulary. One of the things I learned as we were embarking on this question of poverty is while poverty came up, many of the students they're living it, but we didn't have necessarily like a register to think through what it means. And then also register to think of the histories of how poverty has come about. So we had to do some exercises around that. But we do a lot of counter storytelling in the decolonizing pedagogy work. We challenge master storylines, dominant narratives. Media is like so infested with dominant stories, and it doesn't take hard to just pick a film, a hip hop video. A lot of it's commodified, and just put it out there and have the students critically affect. How is this representing gender? How is this representing sexuality, race? What does it say about you? How do we begin to challenge that? Counter storytelling is about naming, but it's also about remembering. Another aspect of the work, it's about healing and healing ourselves through the process. Sometimes what happens, if you kind of ignore healing, a lot of critical literacy work, it's kind of stuck in what I frame as an academic sort of disposition. Like we read a lot of stuff. A lot of college courses can be like that. We read all these histories, but in the end of the day, we never personalize it. We never bring it back home. And I think once we connect it back to our realities and to our lived experiences, we begin that process of healing, because students will do that. And I'm not going to speak to this, but in some of the projects, I focus on what's called the schooling biographies. We're going to work on deconstructing, first understanding what schooling is. We're going to begin with your lives, because they have 16 years or 12 years of experience of schooling. And we're going to begin with that. But then we're going to read certain texts to help us deconstruct and understand what schooling has meant to you. And then, these are kind of 6 weeks programs I'm part of. Then we're going to write about that. I want you to rewrite your story from your perspective. And it does not take long before students really ground it. And it becomes a very emotional, a very empowering space for them to tell story and to speak against the ways in which they've been marginalized. My son yesterday, I was with him. I've had him for the last 3 days. And he told me, he came up to me, he's kind of shy, and he's teaching him how to breakdance. He does really good work. He's got a lot of agency, and he's very funny. But he approached me with little hands in his pocket. He's like, Papi, my teacher called me a slowpoke. Am I a slowpoke? And so he's already on vacation. Like, it's done. I said, well, what do you mean your teacher called you? So then he was remembering the teacher calling him a slowpoke. And I said, well, can you tell me more? What happened is that Santi supposedly isn't neat. So he's a kindergarten. And so he has to do stuff real neatly. But what the teachers don't understand is Santi's very methodic. Like right now he's all into sketching and drawing. And we just let him like sketch and draw. And he's just like drawing things. And he can do 2 hours of that all by himself, which makes my parenting easy, I'll be honest. I have 2 kids. And he's drawing and sketching. But what's interesting is like the way he's taken up slowpoke. And then he told me, have you heard of the term? And I had to go back, like, where does it come from? I had to do some decolonizing work at home. It's not abstract work. I had to tell him, Santi, you are not slowpoke. What do you do? You know the parkour thing, the jumping that people do? He's like super agile. And he took Taekwondo and he's real fit. I said, are you slow? No, you're not slow. But I relate this, and it comes home because Santi looked at me and was about to cry. And also as a father, I felt kind of like, it kind of got emotional, but I also had to be kind of a bigger me and say, no, let's talk through this. As an educator, how do we work through? You are not, that term does not make you who you are. But the idea of what I'm communicating is that as educators, our language is very consequential. What we use should never be taken for granted in describing students. But likewise, language can be very empowering and healing when we come into classrooms and we say, everybody here is very beautiful. You are all geniuses. We love each other here. Those are the ways that we begin to recreate and heal and ultimately reclaim the practices, our bodies, and the spaces that we're a part of. So I'm going to get to the example of the classroom space that I've been a part of. And I'm going to show you some of what we did. But naming is big. This for us is critically understanding our lives, but using text in that process. Counter storytelling is a rich tradition and powerful strategy for challenging the dominant storylines about historically dominated groups. And then we have healing, but I'm gonna move through because I know I have like 10 minutes, correct? Yeah. Okay, so in this class, this is one summer, this was 2015. This was my last summer at Cal State Fullerton. And I work with Santa Ana students, and I write about this in my book. And so there's a set of processes that took place. Youth participatory action research, it's one of many, if you will, pedagogical and curricular strategies where we bring research into the classroom, where students take ownership over that process. And it's not an academic exercise. It's them really trying to solve problems in their community. And so what the Santa Ana students saw as an issue was poverty. And that came up with a lot of contradictions when we went through the initial brainstorming what that means. Some of the students having internalized ideas about, my family's kind of poor, but I see my cousin, he's lazy. We resorting to a deficit ways of thinking about what poverty is. And also some students bringing actually criticality already to the space and challenging that. So these are kind of, if you will, three major stages. One is the process of identifying issues and problems. The other is collective brainstorming on those. And you can see the second slide. One of the students that I followed up with, one of the groups, after the 6 weeks, I followed with 2 research design teams for 18 months. And they were looking at schooling itself. And they were looking specifically at school funding because they were very intrigued and they felt like our schools are impoverished materially, not the people. They made it very clear, it's not us, the schools are. They're overcrowded. We got 48 kids. I don't know if those are the ratios you have in high school, but 48 to 1, that's pretty crazy. And it's insane. And I also use strategies of photo voice and community mapping and action research. This is a haiku poem one of the students created, incarcerated, those living without schooling, searching for escape. So they were telling a lot of story in and through those spaces. And this gives you a snapshot of the curriculum, how it unfolded. So it's a 6-week summer program. I had them every day. And then I followed up with 2 design teams for a period of time. And so what I want to look at is the beginning piece. I use a lot of writing because it's a writing and research seminar. And I transformed that. We're not just going to write. We're going to bring research. And the students, they would go back. So it was residential. They're with me, but they go back to their communities on the weekends. And they're with their families. And that's when they were going back, collecting data, analyzing a situation, and coming back. What's important for me is that we have to ground what we're going to engage in a critical analysis of what we're going to do in our lives. And so how I do that is through text. And one of those, we do a lot of academic literacy work. And I'm going to share one instance. These are 2 video clips. So for us to understand poverty, we got into some texts. And we actually started with Malcolm X's autobiography because it's a very beautiful story of how he comes to read. Because as I'm teaching writing and they're getting into research, what I'm doing is also, quote unquote, motivating students to see the possibilities of writing. And somebody like Malcolm, who taught himself how to read by copying the dictionary, and he talks about the first word I learned was aardvark, AA. The students connect on that because there's a point in Malcolm's story where he says he's in prison teaching himself how to read. And he said he had never been so truly free in his life. And I pose that question to students. When is writing liberatory? When is it not? How can we transform it? So part of this bigger thing is me getting them into the practice of becoming researchers and writers and scholars. So we develop an extended definition of poverty using resources. And so one of the texts was Eduardo Galeano's Open Veins of Latin America, just the first introductory piece. And so that's what I'm going to share with you. So I'm going to put 2 clips. And the first one is, so the students were getting into the text of Eduardo Galeano's Open Veins of Latin America. And we all were struggling through the text. And I love those struggles about working through, revisiting. And we took a whole aside in this moment. We literally took 3 whole days to unpack 2 paragraphs. We went closely into it, sometimes going to dictionaries, going back to students' experiences, using my own knowledge. But then what I did as part of this is also give students a space to exercise. So one of the concepts that Eduardo Galeano talks about is the notion of development and underdevelopment between countries. Because if we're going to understand poverty in Santana, we need to look at the historical context that has shaped the poverty of student Chicanos in places like Orange County. And so we went historical. And Eduardo Galeano provides an actually beautiful story and writes really well in contextualizing this. And so understanding the relationship between the economic development of one area and the underdevelopment of another as a colonial and imperialist strategy became a fundamental concept mediated by close text analysis and discussion. The text students engage here is the introductory chapter of Eduardo Galeano's Open Veins of Latin America. Guiding questions, whole class readings of 2 sections in the chapter, and small group readings facilitated understanding of the text. Here in this video clip I'm going to share, I am with a group of 6 students working and struggling through the meaning of a text that is quite dense in content. To note, I had originally designed individual and whole class reading, but given students' responses, we took a turn that was quite productive. We dedicated almost 3 days unpacking this chapter. These kinds of turns become generative through a focus on quality and going deeper, rather than skimming and glossing over text and their meanings. The sequence of interactions moves from small group discussion of the text that then transitions into students graphically mapping out the concept of development and underdevelopment using visual representations which smaller groups present in class. So it's a short clip, it's about a minute, and I hope we can hear some of the interaction that's taking place. What I was going to share is the students unpacking these very complex concepts, underdevelopment, development, the relationship between the two. And what happens is, in my analysis of what takes place here, these spaces, they become opportunities for joint meaning making as students design a visual that represents the concept of development and underdevelopment. Because Eduardo Galeano is very graphic, I literally had students graphically represent what is North America and also Mexico and Latin America. And so they design a visual that represents the concept of development and underdevelopment. I argue that their presentation is more than a repetition of the ideas they discussed within their smaller groups. What you see in the clip that we get a chance to see is the students kind of using a lot of the language of colonization and development, and they're presenting to each other. And one of the things that's very important is for us to understand that these exercises, their processes in appropriating concepts and terms and language, the students are becoming literate in understanding very complex ideas, and they do it in their own ways. And for me, what was significant as an educator in this space was really taking those 3 whole days to unpack these 2 paragraphs. This is the critical literacy work that we do. And I'm going to end with sharing some. I interviewed the students 4 years after this program. So this was recent. And the students, one of the things, because it's about cultural relevance, and one of the things you see them talking about here is it's got to connect to their lives. That's what makes it purposeful. And so Santiago, in the very end, because I asked him what is the significance of all the text that we read, and he says, I like that it got personal. We were focusing on Chicano stories that were written by the minorities. We were not talking about the majority group and how they see the world. We saw how their lives were impacted by the past. The curriculum was relevant because they connected on a very deep level. How we use text matters in these courses. And so what I'm going to share is this piece. I want to end with this. It's really important because the students began to see themselves differently through engaging in this critical work and in the action research. And for me, that's the most significant. Yes, you can learn about a lot of abstract concepts, but if it doesn't connect to you and how you position yourself, then in my view, I haven't done the work that I need to do as an educator. And so Luis says, researching about where it is, it's almost, epistemology is one of the words that we learned. It's important to see the perspectives of the school, what they are getting funded for, because that affects our education. I think that's what's made our research more personal, because school affects our daily life. So Luis and Santiago were part of the research design focusing on schooling, and then I followed with them for at least a year after. What made our research more personal, because school affects our daily life. As students, they give up in school because either they hate a teacher, they don't like school, and most of the time it's because they can't connect to it. And then look at Santiago. What empowered me, as I said before, the Chicano pipeline. I want to be a change into it. I want to ultimately, when I go to college and through my major, I want to know that I made an impact. I think one of the things now is I want to be an educator and come back to my school in Santana. I want to be a role model to like my students, you know. I think that's what empowered me, because I want to change the statistics. I don't want my group of people to be seen as a minority. We need to become like the majority in school as well. The students begin to prefigure themselves in a different way. They're currently now in their first year, complete their first year of college. And they're along a beautiful journey. So I think I want to end here, because I know I want to be respectful of the time, but I want to share something, this last part. Our ethical relation to students is the groundwork for seeding all this work. That is primarily what we need to begin thinking about. There's a whole group of people in the learning sciences exploring this. It's very beautiful, because we talk about work, education work is critical and about power and political, but we really talk about the ethical work, the relationality, the rehumanization that needs to happen. And what this really comes down to is how we see the spirituality in the work we do every day. And I end with this quote by Grace Lee Boggs. She says, "These are the times that try our souls. Each of us needs to undergo a tremendous philosophical and spiritual transformation. Each of us needs to be awakened to a personal and compassionate recognition of the inseparable interconnection between our minds, heart, and bodies, between our physical and psychic well-being, and between ourselves and all the other selves. We do not want to create schools that negate the experience of somebody like Amarilis, that forget her, or where kids get to a point where they hate it when they loved it when they started. Or you have a young kid who's in kindergarten and is being called a slowpoke. And for him, that's important, because he's already being dehumanized. But the power we have is we can transform that too. If language is used as a vehicle to dehumanize, we can also use it as a space and a vehicle to rehumanize ourselves. So apologies about the video, but and also I went over a lot, some of the time, but gracias, Tlazokamati, and thank you.